So what the above article begins to do is to introduce a slightly different way of thinking about your coaching. It offers a longer term, broader view that gets you thinking about the wider experience of the participant in the sport and also gets you to think about the environment that your coaching happens in. It asks you to consider how the various people, structures around the athlete influence them and their wider experience of the sport. Ultimately, it asks you to think about how you optimize their experience. Now, what we tend to do and what we typically do as coaches is that we tend to focus here. We tend to focus purely on the coach and the athlete. That is the people that are in front of you, the people that you're turning up to help, the most obvious people that are in front of you. But very often, the other things that have a really profound impact and a really profound difference on your coaching and on the participant's experience often get ignored. Now, these could be parents, they could be guardians, they could be a whole host of different people that interact with the participant. The other thing that we tend to ignore is the role of the club and the club structure. Where are these things happening? What are the policies of the club? What's it like when you walk into the clubhouse? What's it like when you turn up at the track? And what's it like when you go to other competitions? What's it like when you go to other clubs? All of these things are well worth considering when you're trying to optimize the experience of the athlete in front of you. Now, based on this idea of optimizing experience, there are some really useful things that you might want to consider. For example, here is the idea of the ping pong model. Now, what the ping pong model asks you to do is to think about the range of different experiences that athletes have of your sport and in your sport, especially with you. So, if we think about what happens from entry, some people will have an experience like this, really narrow. Now, what this will do is develop very specific performers who can operate in quite a simple way. Now, what we'll see is they'll tend to progress really fast, but their adaptability and the range of different things that they develop along the way might be pretty low. So you can imagine in a team sport context, what this might be is you have a girl who starts playing as an under 12 and she gets pigeonholed into a specific position and she stays in that position. She doesn't change. Her experience is quite narrow. She might get quite good quite quickly, but she might miss out on a load of skill development that might be more useful to her later on. Completely in contrast, you might end up with a participant who has a really wide range of different experiences, lacking coherence, doesn't really understand what's going on, but because they're very self-motivated, perhaps they've got other people encouraging them to stick with it, they might stay in there. Their progress might be quite limited, it might take them longer, but their adaptability, their range of skills might be higher. But, of course, there's a real risk of them dropping out. Now, this is an interesting idea. This is the idea of the Goldilocks. And this is the idea that what we really want is not too much variation in their experience, but just about right. Now, obviously, this is going to be different for different sports. But let's say we have an athlete and they're interested in taking part in a range of different events. And as they get older, they start narrowing down a little bit. But it never gets too narrow. It's just about right for them. These are the kinds of ideas that you might want to start thinking about in your coaching and also in your club environment. Now, ultimately, what we really want to achieve is coherence for the participant. Now, that means both horizontally across a period of time, they get similar experiences. Think about that ping pong, just about right, the Goldilocks zone. Now, these experiences ideally reinforce each other. So when the participant is working with one coach, they get the same sort of values, beliefs reinforced as they do with an assistant coach. Now, this also isn't just horizontal across your age group. It also happens vertically, that is throughout time. Ideally, previous experience builds to the next. So for example, if you're playing a team sport, it's likely that you want to gradually build towards an adult version of the game and not just chuck young players onto an enormous pitch with adult-sized equipment. It's a gradual progression. Now the same thing happens here, both horizontally and vertically. because we want participants to have a coherent experience within their age group in your sport. We want them to have a coherent experience within the club. So when they walk in the clubhouse and they meet other coaches, we want the same values, beliefs, behaviours that are being promoted by your coaching by others, and the same within the sport. So, for example, if you go to a competition, is it okay to be arguing with the decisions of umpires with referees? Is that what's normal around here? If so, we're perhaps not reinforcing the level of coherence necessary for the young performer. Now, to achieve this kind of coherence, ideally what we want to do is generate a level of integration. Now, this is what happens in the typical club, in the stereotypical club setting. Now, you'll see a number of different levels of performance here. Now, what we might typically see is that we might get a bit of communication. We might get different people working together a little bit at different stages. Now, that might be between coach, club, participant, parent. We might see a little bit of crossover between levels, where youth and junior might talk to each other, perhaps the result of parents who are friends, perhaps a result of siblings that are involved. Now, what this ultimately means is there's limited working togetherness. There's a lack of integration across the typical club, and perhaps between clubs. It's very reliant on a small number of relationships. Now, in the perfect club setting, something different happens. In the perfect club, we start seeing this sort of thing going on, where lots and lots of people are working together to support the experience of the athlete. And ideally, this is done pretty formally. People will take time deliberately to sit down, discuss with each other, and make sure they're all working together, they're integrating to make sure the participant at the end of it gets a really positive experience.